Ahoy! Recently I talked about PvP scaling and how it worked in the last beta. And in that video I explained in much detail how exactly it functioned in the most previous beta, but I didn't go too deep on the arguments for or against it. In this video I wanted to follow up on that a little bit because I made a poll and I asked you guys what you thought about PvP scaling. So my question was, how do you feel about PvP scaling in New World right now? Do you prefer the current version with a big difference between levels, or the closed beta version where there was very little difference between levels, or some middle ground between the two? This is what the votes looked like. So 12% of you wanted to have something like the current beta where we have a relatively big difference between the levels in terms of damage output and everything else. Then 17% of you wanted the closed beta version where there's relatively little difference between levels, and 34% wanted a middle ground. Now what we need to establish first, especially for those of you who haven't played one or both of the betas, is how exactly the scaling was in either of them. So as demonstrated in my recent video, you would basically double your damage within 20 levels against a target with no armor. Including armor, it would be a little bit less of a gap between them, but either way there was a massive difference in terms of damage output just from the weapon hits alone, and then all the other perks would add on top of that, all your weapon skills, all your ability perks from armor and all that type of stuff, so you'd get a very big advantage overall. In the closed beta, things were much closer, and a level 20 had a fighting chance against a level 60 if they were significantly better at the game. Obviously the level 60 would still have plenty of gear advantages and would have the weapon skill advantages, but you could, if you were just really good as a PvPer, beat a level 60 purely PvE player, for example. There were also some potential outlier cases, though that remained mostly hypothetical because the beta wasn't that long. So there were theories that you could potentially have certain builds that would allow you to actually be significantly stronger at a lower level because of how Constitution scales and everything. So around level 25 you could maybe, with perfect PvP gear, perfect perks and high weapon mastery and everything else, potentially have like a little bit of an advantage over a high level player. Again, this was super hypothetical and no one was able to fully verify that, but there was the suspicion that if the scaling remains exactly the same, we might see people just min-maxing low-level characters on launch for PvP. But then again, you can't even lock your level, so that would be a temporary benefit as well, because you still get some XP from PvP after all. So those concerns were technically there, but in the bigger picture of things, they were probably minor. In the vast majority of situations, the higher level player should have had the advantage. There were also some other things that were unclear simply because the beta wasn't long enough. For example, the difference between 500 and 600 gear score in PvP scaling, how much that would be scaled down, especially when fighting lower level enemies, or if the level 60 would eventually get a pretty significant advantage anyways. And that brings us to a bit of an issue when it comes to finding the perfect balance, because there are two factors at play that are basically impossible to completely weigh against each other in a fair way. One of them is the level, so you can scale the damage in a way that works relatively fairly from level 1 to level 60. That would be fine by itself. The other point is the gear score, and the gear score gradually goes up to 500 at level 60. When you reach level 60, you're at 500 gear score. However, this is only a starting point on level 60, and your goal point basically currently is 600 gear score. Potentially there may even be options to get more than 600 gear score. So how can we factor that in PvP? Because this means a fully geared level 60 player with high-end gear would have an advantage over a level 60 player that just hit level 60. And I think most people would say that is reasonable because they just grinded the much better gear. But at the same time, how do you scale that down against lower levels? If you base the entire PvP scaling on gear score instead of level, that leads to a problem. Why would I want to get better gear at level 60 for PvP? If any gear score just gets reduced to be scaled fairly against other levels anyways, then there isn't really much benefit in increasing my gear score. Sure, you get some extra perks here and there, but really the overall benefit would be significantly lower. So there has to be some point where this gap kind of kicks in at level 60 either way. Even if you have a very fair scaling from level 1 to level 60, once you get to the point where the level 60s get their high-end gear with high gear score, they will likely get a more significant advantage in any PvP system that could currently be implemented. So if you just want to specifically give an advantage to high-level players, you don't really need to do much. You could just scale from level 1 to 60 in a relatively regular pattern and then just say, okay, if you get better gear on level 60, that is where the advantage for you really kicks in, and that's fine. Again, could. This is just one of many options. Now I want to look a little bit at the arguments of either side here for or against level scaling. People who are for a big difference in damage output between low-level and high-level players mainly argue that that is how MMORPGs work and that is how MMOs should work. They say that you should get rewarded for leveling up, for grinding a lot, for getting stronger in terms of levels, in terms of gear, and this advantage should show in combat. That is how most other MMOs handle it, that is what people are used to, and therefore that seems to be the logical approach. Now, there are things worth keeping in mind with New World specifically that make the situation a little bit different. For example, New World is laid out in a way where you often return to low-level areas. In my recent housing guide, I suggested that you should keep one of your houses in Windsward in later levels. That's because it's going to be a trading hub, there are a lot of duels happening there most of the time, and also there are a lot of easy to get low tier resources around. The current crafting system wants you to get a bunch of low level resources, because every high tier resource is crafted from low tier resources. And since those are easier and quicker to farm in those low level areas, you will see high level players run around low level areas. Likewise, territory control also hinges on open world PvP, and high-level players will still want territory control of low-level areas. They will be doing the PvP quest there, they will be fighting over the forts there and everything else. So they will be around and they will likely be PvP flagged. So they may just be running around the area without intentionally wanting to grief low-level players, but just randomly walking into them while they're doing something that they actually need to do. Now, if the damage difference between levels is severe, then the low-level player would have two options here. Fight at a significant disadvantage or don't flag. And the likely outcome is that a lot of low-level players would simply not flag for PvP, even though they may otherwise be interested in it. Additionally, at least at the moment, there are no dedicated level 60 open-world PvP areas. So there isn't really a place for high-level players to specifically go if they're looking to have open-world PvP. Sure, they can run around the high-level areas and hope to run into someone, but they may very well not be flagged. So the general location of where PvP is happening can often shift, and they may just join in on a lower-level Zerg just because they want to join in on the group PvP. And I don't imagine it would be much fun for two fighting groups if a level 60 player with fire staff comes in and just AoE blasts half of their team away. And of course, if somebody went out of their way in terms of griefing and just went around sniping people with a musket as a level 60 and just trying to find low-level flag players, that could lead to even more frustration because no one enjoys getting one shot without even knowing where the enemy is. The most important point of all for me is one that in my opinion overshadows all the other ones, and that is that PvP scaling in a fair way, where you can have a competition against anyone, is a massive selling point. It is something that attracts people who traditionally don't play MMOs. And we can see at the moment that there are a lot of people going into New World that don't necessarily have an MMO background. Some of the best PvPers I've played against were actually people with shooter backgrounds or other backgrounds that just are very mechanically skilled or are very good at aiming. And New World allows us to do that. We have the musket, we have the bow, you have the fire staff, and then you also obviously have a bunch of melee weapons on the other end. So you have a lot of people from very different games coming in. You have MOBA players, you have Dark Souls players, you have shooter players, you have, I guess, Battle Royale players to some degree as well, and of course you have the traditional MMO players. And what you probably notice is that a lot of the genres I just named have a very heavy PvP focus. I mean, even Dark Souls has a pretty active PvP scene. So these people want to fight, these people want to be part of the wars, they want to be part of the open world fighting. They may also be the ones asking for instance fighting, which is a whole different can of worms. Even I am somewhat in that group. I used to play Ragnarok Online back in the day, and I also played plenty of vanilla WoW, but since then I have only briefly touched WoW again, and I haven't really played that many MMOs. I still obviously have my passion for MMOs, but the ones that came out after that just didn't interest me that much, and I played a lot more MOBAs. And yet, because of its unique combat, New World was able to reel me in and get my attention. I learned about the closed beta PvP scaling relatively late, but when I learned about it, I thought it was a fantastic feature. I thought that having a relatively even ground so that your skill matters a lot in a fight, even though you may have some small disadvantages, was a really cool and fair way for PvP. And it meant that even people who otherwise don't enjoy MMOs could find a home in New World and just purely focus on PvP and maybe never even level or just level through PvP. To me personally, that is amazing. Making an MMO accessible to people outside of MMOs and giving them a chance to play the game in the way that they want to, while still also letting them play it in the way of a traditional MMO. And I'm by far not alone on this, by the way. If you watch any other New World content creators and you have a look at their channels, most of them don't have an MMO background or have a little bit of an MMO background but also play a significant amount of other games. I think this is part of what really funnels New World's hype, and it reminds me of vanilla WoW back in the day. When the original World of Warcraft came out, there weren't a lot of other MMORPGs around. Yeah, there was Dark Age of Camelot, there was Ultima Online, but the vast majority of players going to World of Warcraft didn't necessarily come from these games. A lot of them, for example, came from Warcraft 3, which was the strategy game that was in the Warcraft franchise before that. And a lot of people also simply came from completely different games. And I would love to see a renaissance of that type of environment where you get a bunch of different players from different genres that just duke it out in the same game that they all enjoy. So that is my case for a PvP scaling that keeps things relatively fair, even though I'm not opposed to some degree of advantages, especially for level 60 players when they have grinded their high level gear. But I really don't think high level players should be able to like one or two shot low level players. I think the even ground approach has a lot more appeal to it to me personally. And speaking of appeal, I'd like to appeal to you to subscribe to my channel and click the bell if you enjoyed this video. You want to see more New World content. I got a lot of info stuff coming up. Later today we're going to talk about a very interesting way to get repair parts and also get some additional financial benefits from it. And also right here I will be linking the PvP scaling video that I made where I explained it in more detail. So if you're interested in the in-depth mechanics behind it, then you can check that out too. Of course, I'd like to hear your opinions on the scaling in the comments, but please keep it civil, don't rip each other apart. I understand that this is a very controversial topic, but you can fight each other in-game plenty. I wasn't planning to talk about PvP scaling again, but I saw so much discussion and I figured I want to offer some perspective here. But with this, I'm kind of closing the chapter a little bit until launch, where I'm sure we'll see some changes to that again, and then we can talk about it again. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you for the next one later. Sloth, out.